You, just tell me your name again.
Hedy Lustig.
Okay, Hedy. When you were growing up, where did you grow up, which town, and what was life like before the war?
I remember I was born in 1930, and I can remember as a very, very small child that life was strange because when I was 3 years old, I went to a school, kindergarten, with nuns. Shortly thereafter, I was not allowed to go to school anymore. I had to go to a Jewish school, which was part of our synagogue. I was not allowed to play with children because I guess my mother was afraid that somebody would harm me. As early as, I guess, I think Hitler got in 33, and as early as 1934, 35, it was unbearable to be Jewish.
How old were you approximately? You were just a little girl. You were just...
Absolutely, a very small child.
Do you remember the normal times? I mean, what was it like?
The normal time was picking blackberries in the forest with my parents and going for long walks, going to synagogue on the Sabbath, which we did every Saturday. But most of my life was not normal. It was not, I never got the opportunity to be a small child. I felt like I always had to be grown for my age. When I was, I'd say, 5 or 6, and I was beginning school at the Jewish school, we used to have to go to the doctor in another city. The whole school would take busloads of children to another city, Darmstadt, in order to go to the doctor or to the dentist. You'll have to excuse me.
No problem. So they would take you by the busload to go to the doctor?
By the busload, because
come?
no non-Jewish person would treat a Jewish person. I think the non-Jewish people were afraid because Nazism was already beginning. I remember, going to the dentist in Darmstadt. One of the most vivid recollections is when my brother and I used to try to go to school. We would leave our home, and it was maybe 3 or 4 blocks from school, and many days we didn't make it to school because adult Nazis would run after us with butcher knives. So we would run back home. It was like this at all times. At night when we try to sleep, my father had to board up the house. We lived in a 2-story house, and downstairs was my father's butcher shop, and behind our home was my father's we had a big packing house, plus my dad owned lots of land, and in Europe you own tracts of land away from your village. And my father had to board up the house, the windows, in order for us to sleep at night, because at night the Nazis would come and throw rocks in our windows. My father's store was closed, I guess, in about 36 or 37, because nobody would patronize it anymore. People were sincerely the ones that were not Nazis were afraid to have any dealings at all with the Jewish people. My dad had fought in the First World War for Germany. He had 12 brothers and sisters. And he couldn't understand how Germany could betray him like this. You know, Jewish people in Germany were just as comfortable as we are as Americans right here in America. They were part of everything. So it was like overnight, everything changed for us. It was frightening for a young lady, young children. As I was a little girl, I remember my mother used to push my little brother in a carriage. Not my mother, we had a maid at that time. But after that, after I'd say about 34 or 35, we had no more help. We did everything ourselves, and we could barely scrounge enough food for us to eat because people didn't want to sell to the Jews. And I lived in a small town, and it was even worse. And my uncles, where my father was born, also lived in a small town, and the Nazis were even worse there. So my father and a brother that lived in our community would go occasionally and bring them food because they absolutely had no way to provide themselves with food or meats or whatever. I lived through Kristallnacht. I was 8 years old, but like I said, I was never a small child. I was always an adult, and I missed not being a small child. And Kristallnacht, we had already gotten papers to come over to the USA. At that time, we were just a Jewish problem. The Jewish problem could still leave Germany. We were still able to get out of Germany.
In 38.
Up until Kristallnacht. We had our papers to come to the USA. We were in our home, and we had, you know how you are when you leave someplace forever. We were getting our things together. We had relatives that came to see us, to say goodbye to us. We had a seamstress at our house making us a few clothes or whatever. About 5 or 6 that evening, Nazi came by. I have his name, but it's ridiculous to even mention names because nobody would know here who they are.
But I think you should, if it
well,
doesn't.
I have it recorded.
Okay.
You know. But anyway, he came by, and he was sent by the stormtroopers to turn off electricity. He told my parents and I, my whole family, he told them that tonight we're getting rid of the Jewish problem. He said all of Germany, the electricity was to be cut off from the Jewish homes. Well, my father was very excited and upset. Well, we knew things were bad, and we didn't know, you know, we felt like we would get away before worse things happened. Dad went to see some other people, Jewish people, and they had heard the same thing. He came back home, and we decided we had to take off and run. I lived in a home that I was born in, and the May family from Nashville, Tennessee, was also born in this home. They lived upstairs in our home. There was an old gentleman, I'd say he was in his 80s. His name was Abraham May. He had a daughter her name was Matilda May. She was not married. She went with us. We decided to run away. So Matilda, an uncle that was visiting us, Uncle Moritz from Risselsheim. I'm trying to think. My mother, my father, my brother, and I, we ran through the woods. This is in November, and Europe at that time was pretty cold already in November. We took whatever we had on our backs, and we ran through the woods for several days. And it was frightening because here was an old woman that was a seamstress with us, this Matilda. My uncle finally left us. We walked, like I said, for a couple of days and nights, and we would feel like we heard people running after us. We were hungry. My brother was small. He was 6 years old, and he kept crying he wanted something to eat. I was hungry also, but I was scared. We decided, well, maybe whatever had transpired was over with. We would try to return to our home. We'd proceed getting ready for our trip. We get back to our home. We see debris all over the place. Crystal, silver, furniture that hatches had been taken to. But at that time, we were not concerned about the furniture, nor the silver, nor the whatever. We saw Nazis coming. My father ran, and he hid in the attic. And we also hid with him. But they found us. They had no problem finding us. They took my father. They took, I can't even think, what do they hit you with, a club? They took a club and beat him across the nose and his eyes, and they said, all Jews have to have crooked noses. While they were beating my father, and they took him to a concentration camp, my mother, this other lady that lived upstairs, the May family, Matilda, and myself, we started running again. Where to, we didn't know. Mother had a little money with her, not a lot. We had nothing to eat. We started through the woods again. We were so frightened. Here's a woman with 2 little children and Matilda, and we don't know where to go. I don't know how many days we were in the woods. We would stop at train stations, and we were afraid they could detect that we were Jewish. We finally got to a train station, and we proceeded to take a train. Here we'd not eaten in days. We got on the train, and we were going to Risselsheim. I had an aunt that lived there. We made it to Risselsheim. On the train, there were lots of Nazis, and we felt like they could detect who we were, but they didn't. We got to Risselsheim. We went to see my Aunt Ida. She was no longer there. She had been taken to a concentration camp. She had lived in an apartment house. We went to see, I don't know whether he was the owner of the apartment house or a super of the apartment house. He saw how hungry and frightened we were. He offered to feed us, but we sat down. I kept crying to Mother. I I had a mind way beyond my years. I said, Mother, they're going to kill us. Don't eat, they're going to poison us. We left there and we went to see another uncle. We took a train. I'm sure my mother was exhausted. You know, 2 small children. Somehow Matilda was no longer with us.
You don't know how she
No, I don't.
got lost?
No, but she was no longer with us. We went to see this other uncle who was employed by Opal. And believe it or not, their family was still intact. But the reason being, they needed him in the factory. I don't know what his position was, where, you know, my parents would know, but I don't know what his position was.
What was his name and what town was he in?
His name was Uncle Moritz, and he was in, I can't think right now the name of the town. I do know, but
Was
it's
it in
just
Germany?
Yeah, it was in Germany.
Was he an uncle on your dad's side?
My father's brother. My father was one of 12 brothers and sisters. And out of all the 12 brothers and sisters, only 4 survived. All the rest of them, uncles, aunts, cousins, young people, they were all killed. So from a large family, I have hardly any family. But anyway, we got to my uncle's house, and I had 2 cousins, and they were older than I, and I had such a good time with them. Well, they're gone. They were killed in the concentration camps. We stayed with them a number of days, and they traced my mother to, they knew exactly where all the Jewish people lived and who they were and who their relatives were. They traced my mother to this home and sent her a telegram and said she had to come back to Höchst, my hometown, and clean up the mess the Nazis had made. Well, she went back and she had to clean up the debris that they had made. We had like a courtyard, and most of the things were thrown out in the courtyard. The bedding was cut, you know, like feather bedding, which you had in Germany. They were all cut and destroyed. My mother still owns furniture. We still have furniture here in the States that are living testaments to what happened, because the furniture, they used hatchets on the furniture, and we had it covered with pieces of wood. The mirrors in my mother's armoire were destroyed. They were hit. We have no more mirrors. We didn't want a mirror on that again because we wanted a reminder of what had happened to us. We never wanted to forget, nor do I want my children to forget, nor my grandchildren, because I feel like things like that can happen again.
The time period from Kristallnacht till when your mother had to go home to clean up, we're talking a couple weeks?
I'd say a couple of weeks. My mother went back home and cleaned up, and in the meantime, she went to the mayor of our town and said, please, where is my husband? Is he still alive? We found out he was in Buchenwald. And Mother said, we will not be a problem. We have our papers. We have everything intact. Could you get him out? We'll go. You know, we're ready to go. They, believe it or not, they let my father out. When I first saw my father, he came to my uncle Moritz, where we were staying. Mother had come back to this place.
Did she come back knowing he was going to be out? So
Oh yeah, oh yes.
They had let him out. Had he already been to Buchenwald?
Oh yeah, he was there for like, I'd say, this was November, December. We left the end of January. He was there like I'd say a couple of months. They let him out. My father looked like a living skeleton. Let's say, where was I?
Well, I wanted you to start from the description of when your
dad.
family was first reunited and your father came back. You were talking about what he looked like and
Okay.
what it felt like. Yeah.
Oh, okay. My father looked like a living skeleton when he came back from the camp. We were almost frightened of him, and he told us of some of the experiences at camp. He told us that they had one thing to eat a day, and it was just water with some things. It must have been a soup. He said if they wanted water to drink, they got water to drink when it rained. They'd have to run out and drink the water from the roof, as it was dripping off the roof. He said there were people that would run out. They were afraid or they wanted to get away, and there were barbed wires, and they were electrocuted because they had electricity in them. It was an unbelievable happening. We left my aunts. We really could only leave with the things on our back. We did have furniture that came over. They call it a lift. They bring to the USA. And we did bring what remained of our furniture to the U.S. I think the happiest day of our lives were when we left Germany.
So you all gathered in the town where Uncle Moritz lived. How long were you there, all of you together? Your brother, your mom, you and your dad?
Not very long, probably a couple of days. And I know sometime during that period we went to see my grandparents who lived, after we left Uncle Moritz, we went to see my grandparents, my mother's parents, who lived in Breisach. And they were still there, but not long after that, they moved to Switzerland because my grandmother on my mother's side was from Switzerland. She was from Endingen and Lengnau. And this particular community in Switzerland had Jews from many, many years before. I recently had the opportunity to visit Endingen and Lengnau, and there are 2 synagogues there, and there are no more Jews there because this used to be a ghetto in Switzerland. But we went to see my grandparents, and it was very painful because we knew we would never see them again. My grandparents passed away, and we really didn't get to see them again because they passed away during the war in Switzerland with relatives. You had asked me earlier, and I did remember some good times going to my grandparents' house when I was a very small child.
Before any of this happened?
Before any of this happened, I used to travel to Breisach, which is on the Rhine, and visit my grandparents, and they were precious people. And I did have a good time there.
When you were visiting them, how long were you there? And did you have your papers at this point? Whatever you had taken from your house, did you have your...
Oh, we had our papers with us at all times.
But your immigration stuff too that you'd gotten ready?
Everything. Everything ready to go.
So how long did you stay in Breisach?
Not very long. I mean, time to a small child is, I really couldn't tell you whether it was 2 days or a week. we left from there saying goodbye to all our relatives. And I think I told you before we left Germany, I have a book that I brought.
Why don't you show us?
With me. I had all of my relatives and cousins write a message in this book, and it means a great deal to me. And I've given you my age, so you know this book is about 50 years old. We have prayer books we brought from Germany also, and my son, being a rabbi, was very interested in those, and he has most of those prayer books. My mother, who is now 80, almost 89, lives here in Nashville with me, and she has many of those books, and she has one prayer book that she brought over with her, and every day of her life she reads that prayer book, and she thanks God that she could come over here and work. And when we came to this country, both my mother and father had to go to work because it was 39 and we were not able to bring money over nor any really worldly possessions. We had to leave everything behind that we had, with the exception of the few pieces of furniture. And it was my job at HA to take care of my brother, who was younger than I. So, like I said, I was never able really to be a small child. But Mother has this prayer book that she, like I said, thanks the good Lord every day for letting her survive, for letting her be able to go to work each day. Now, I can think of many people that pray to God and thank them that they can go to work, but that's a fact.
I want to talk about your time with your grandparents again.
In Brysa.
Brysa. And that's when you had this book filled out.
Well, I had this filled out in Brysa, and also had it filled out when I stayed with my Uncle Moritz and the cousins and other relatives, because I thought that was very important.
Is there like one little passage in there or something?
Well,
that
they're all
you could,
German.
Oh, they're
so,
all. Oh.
You know, I can read it, but very slowly.
Is there any thought that, I mean, you've probably had this translated to you before. Is there something special you remember that one of your relatives wrote in there to you?
Well, my grandmom wrote in there how special I was to her and how much she loved me, and that means a great deal to me. Since she was a precious lady and I was never again to see her, that these are my relatives and my friends. And I feel like each day that I live, I have to enjoy the sunshine and the trees and the flowers much more than anybody else, because I always feel like I have to see things in a bigger perspective, I guess, because I figure I'm seeing it for the 6 million Jews that perished in Germany.
How long were you in Brysa, and how did you end up leaving there? Tell us what happened from that point and who was with you still at this point.
Well, my mother and father were with me, and we left, and when we left, we went to Hamburg. And in Hamburg, we got on our ship, and the name of the ship was the Hansa, which was evidently a German ship. It took, I would say, about a week or more to come to the States. There were many people from Germany leaving for the USA, many refugees at that time.
Was your mom with you?
Mom and Dad were both with me, and my brother. And none of us could speak English once we got to the States. And I remember getting to New York City, and we had my one uncle that lived in the same town I did, who was Uncle Max, my father's brother, had migrated to New York early in 34 or 5. He knew what was coming, and he had some people that sponsored him earlier. See, the only way you could come to the U.S. was to be sponsored by a person in the U.S. and for them to put up money for you if you got into some sort of trouble. You know, they had to be responsible for you.
What year, or if you happen to remember the day or the month, when was it that you left Germany. And got on that boat and came to the States?
We left in January and
of
1939, and we came to the States in January of 39.
At that point, you couldn't have understood or known what was happening to so many other Jews and how lucky your father was.
We did know how lucky.
You did know. Talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely, because, you know, we were almost certain whoever was behind was not to come to the U.S. again. I mean, was not to leave Germany, because my father had written a letter in 1950 to Germany, one of the few people that wrote a letter telling what happened to him. And when they took him to the concentration camp, he mentioned the names of people that beat him. And at one time they wanted to take him to somebody's courtyard and kill him. And another gentleman intervened. I don't know that he was a gentleman, but evidently he had enough heart. He was a Nazi also. But my father knew all these people all his life, and they turned on him overnight. He went, they took my father first to jail, where they beat him some more. Next to his jail cell was a Mrs. Kahn. They had taken her. And my father describes that he was bleeding from his ears, his nose, and his eyes. And his face was so swollen you could hardly recognize him. He said if it had not been for this one other Nazi that had some feeling, you know, couldn't stand to see him killed, he would not have survived.
That was the first night?
That was the first night. Then they took my father to a concentration camp in a train, and he describes all this. Before, he also describes, I don't think I mentioned the fact that around Kristallnacht, our synagogue was burned in Germany, and my father witnessed that. And in this letter he sent back to Germany, he mentions that he witnessed the burning of the synagogue because he went to our Lara Khan, which was our rabbi and teacher in this small town. And they were no longer able to meet at the synagogue. So they met at his home and worshiped. And my father made a minyan. From Lara Khan's house, they watched the synagogue burn. And they knew who burned the synagogue. And they threw out prayer books and burned the prayer books. My father described this in the letter.
And the letter he wrote to you all from the camp, or?
No, we're getting a little. This letter he wrote after we came to the USA, to Germany, and he sent the letter to Germany in 1950. And as far as I know, that letter is one of the few letters that was ever sent describing what happened and the people who, especially in the area that I was from, because I've talked to some Germans, and the letter is on file in Darmstadt. I have a copy of the letter But the only way I could get a copy of this letter was a German man went and copied it for me by hand. He was not able to even photostat it. And this is 1990. This was last year, 1989.
He sent the letter to German officials to
Right.
let them
know what happened and that the people that did these atrocities should be punished. Now, in this letter, evidently, many of them had been punished. It was sad when you see a man that had a business in Germany and he could no longer do anything. And my father, we came over, my dad was, I would say, he was about 47 and had to start all over again. But not even in his trade or whatever he was doing.
How long did the voyage take? And was it a pretty modern ship? Was the voyage itself okay?
The Voyage was a very modern ship. I have yet to go on a cruise. I've never had a desire to go on a cruise. I don't know why. This was a modern ship. They had all the things you have on cruises nowadays, you know, from the wonderful dinners to the parties at night. The only thing, I think we were a little bit out of New York, not far from Ellis Island, and they checked everybody out and somebody broke out with the measles, some small child. And we were terribly afraid that we were going to have to be put off on Ellis Island. And I remember we got up early that morning, crack of dawn, and this was January, and the Hudson River did have ice. I do remember that, but it was a wonderful sight. And we all got up early, all the refugees. They wanted to see the Statue of Liberty, which meant a great deal to everybody. We did manage, they checked everybody out, and those that did have measles had to stay on Ellis Island.
The whole trip took days or weeks?
I would say probably a couple of weeks.
And did you ever consider any other country besides the U.S. to come to? How was the choice made that this was where you were going to come, to the U.S.?
Well, you had to have a sponsor. There was no way out.
And you had a relative?
My father, many, many years before, had written the relatives here and said, we want to come to the United States, because as early as 1934, we knew things were bad for the Jewish people. You know, when they throw rocks in your windows and run after small children with butcher knives, and you're not able to, nobody buys from you because you're a Jew, you decide it's time to leave. But we wrote our relatives and they said, we'll let Israel out, who is my father, and he can establish himself in the USA, and then we'll bring the children and mother out. Well, my father wouldn't leave us. He said, if one of us goes, we're all going together as a family. He didn't want to separate from us. We did get the papers, but there are many people who didn't get papers. There are many people, my uncle, one of my uncles, that Uncle Benjamin from Bearfelden, he lived there till 1945, until they took him to Theresienstadt. And I have nightmares thinking about what they had to live through. His children all got out. They went to Holland and other places, but then they were killed in Holland. But Uncle Benjamin was there until 1945. He and his wife were taken to Theresienstadt, which the Germans, the Nazis, told him that was a resort area with a 2-bedroom apartment. And, you know, and then they gassed them. I just can't fathom what my other relatives must have experienced, because the times that we were there were just unbearable.
And they couldn't get out. Was it that they couldn't because they didn't have a sponsor?
They didn't have a sponsor. Now, there's some Jewish people got out, say in 35, 36. They went to South America, but they had to beg their way, or be smuggled to certain parts of the world. But to go out as a family was just almost impossible.
How did it happen that you came to Nashville?
Because that's the people that sponsored us. The May family, part of the May family was born in the house that I was born in. The Mays had a hosiery mill here, and they brought over at least, I'd say 38, 40 refugees from Germany. I was telling you that the Jewish people at one time were very, very into their communities.
And prominent.
Prominent. And one of the Mays that was from my town, that was born in the house that I was born in, was quite well-to-do. He built a school for my community. He built a bathhouse, because there are a lot of people that didn't have places they could bathe or didn't have a bath in the house. He did so many philanthropic things for this community. And then they turned on all of us.
So you were in New York for how long, and then when did you come to Nashville?
We were in New York with relatives, I guess, for about maybe a week or two. And then we came to Nashville, and that was a frightening experience, because my father, nor my mother, nor my brother and I could speak English. And
who was the specific sponsor? Which May was it?
It was Jacob May that sponsored us, and his brother lived in the same house that I lived in. And this brother, which I forgot to mention, when we left Kristallnacht, this brother, who was in his 80s, he may have been a little bit younger, but to me, I was a small child. He was a very elderly gentleman. They made him come downstairs. While we ran away, they choked him with a scarf of mine on our dining room chair. He didn't survive.
That was Abraham.
That was Abraham May. Abraham May was a brother of Jacob May, who lived in Nashville, Tennessee, and Jacob May has two sons, Mortimer and Dan, who are no longer living. Jacob May brought us to the United States. My father was married to one of the cousins, Abraham's daughter, and she passed away at childbirth. Then my father remarried my mother, who is Clara Reinheimer.
You took the train from New York to Nashville. I take it was still January 1939?
I think it was probably closer to February, middle of February. We came by train, and at 39, things were pretty poor, I guess, in this country. It was right after or during the Depression. And I remember we were so frightened when my cousins in New York put us on the train to go to Nashville, because that was like a 2-day trip by train. And none of us could speak English. And we knew we had to change trains in Chattanooga. And in Chattanooga, we had to go to another train station. And the whole trip we couldn't think about anything but how were we going to get on the right train to Nashville. But we made it, and it was frightening, you know, going along the countryside, and we were afraid because the cattle looked pretty poor at that time, you know, because I guess things were not real good in the USA at that time. But we came to Nashville, and we were met by many of the Mays met us. And the Mays were wonderful to us when we got here. They gave my father a job at the factory and my mother a job at the factory. We had to start from square one. And I think when a man is almost 50, it must be frightening. And my mother was maybe 39. Mother was quite a bit younger than Dad. And she had to go to work and had never worked before in her life and leave the two little children at home. And I again became the mother, because it was my job to see that my brother got ready for school. I got ready for school. I prepared many of the meals, and I did some laundry too at age 8, which was, in fact, neighbors felt so sorry for us because I used to go on a little stool outside and hang clothing up. But we were just so glad to be alive. You know, that to me, nothing, it seemed wonderful to be able to do these things.
And you could go to school finally.
Finally went to school, and young man that was a teenager took me to my first day of school, and I understood absolutely nothing when I got to school. And I do remember I can't forget the name of the book that they were reading. They put me back to the first grade, and I should have been in the third or possibly going into the fourth grade. I went into the first grade, and I remember they were reading the book called Peter and Peggy. And when the teacher used to make the children write, and she would say, skip a line. I remember that so vividly because I thought it was just a funny word, you know. But within about, I'd say 3 weeks, I could speak English, because children pick up the language like their mother tongue. Now, had I come over later, it would have been much different.
Talk about, you talked about how you were taken out of a normal German school and put in a Jewish school when the Nazis took power. And here, what was it like? What school was it, by the way?
The name of the school is Tarbox, which is now a senior citizen center. So,
but here in Nashville?
Here in Nashville, and I lived very close to the school, so my brother and I could walk to school. And it was a complete joy. And I remember we used to have a big hall we would meet in every day. And I remember the teacher, after I spoke English quite well, I got up and she wanted me to tell them the story about what happened to us in Europe. So I used to get up frequently and tell of our experiences.
And you talked about the cruelties that the people and the kids and the adults in Germany did to you even before Kristallnacht. How did the kids in Nashville react?
Oh, they were wonderful. When I came to Temple, there was a family that, being a refugee, I had no clothing whatsoever. One Saturday or Sunday, they picked me up in a station wagon, and that probably was one of the first station wagons. And they took me, a Mrs. Starr picked me up, and she took me to her home in Belmead. And it must have been in June, because that's when my birthday is. And she took me, and she had a birthday party for me. And the kids, I had so many gifts. When she brought me home with a box of gifts, I remember my mother cried. She was overwhelmed, that the people would do this for me. And we also had a wonderful Dr. Lowenstein who's no longer living. When we used to be ill as children, he would come out and treat us, and he wouldn't take any money or pay from my parents. He said, when your children grow up and they have children, they can pay me. So when my kids were born, I used Dr. Lowenstein. He was a precious person because he never accepted, anything from my parents, and he treated us whenever we needed it, and at that time still made house calls.
When you first came, you talked about how the Mays got you guys jobs. Did you have a home to live in?
We lived with a family here for a few days, and then they found us a furnished room, and then they found us a home. We had like a duplex on 16th Avenue South, which is now Music Row. And we lived there for quite a few years. And then my parents purchased their own home. My father always wanted to go back into business here, and Mother just didn't want him to.
So he worked for the Mays, and he earned a decent living.
He worked for the Mays, and then later on he went back into his own, he became a butcher at some other place. But he never did go back into business.
As normal as life could be for you, quickly it turned to be a normal life compared to what you'd been through?
Well, it was somewhat normal, but it was still not normal for a small child to have to do housework and laundry and cook. See, my mother had never worked in her life. And here, she had to take a job and work in a factory and do like production work. So it was not normal as such, It was wonderful that we were here and we could do all these things, but we had to live a little differently from my friends. And it never bothered me. I felt so lucky, and my friends never treated me any different than anybody else because I didn't have the things that they had. They shared with me. That was never a problem.
You mentioned in Germany that you had gone to the synagogue with your parents every week. What kind of, I know they don't have Reform, Conservative, but was it a very religious one, or?
It was Orthodox.
And when you came here and got resettled, did you pick up that practice again of going?
When we came here, we went to the Orthodox synagogue here, which is now the Shereth Israel. And we went to Hebrew school every day, and my brother was bar mitzvahed here. Then I went to the temple. I was confirmed at the temple because really it was we didn't keep kosher anymore. We kept kosher at home. There were no kosher. Well, at that time, I think there were a few kosher butchers in Nashville, but possibly it was more expensive, to be kosher, so we did not keep kosher. I think we kept kosher for a short while, but
when you look back, I think you've already answered some of this question, but when you look back, what are the most dominant feelings about your resettlement? Happiness, you mentioned, joy at being alive.
Oh,
what else?
Just the joy of being near my family. My family, which was so small, meant so much to me. And friends really became family. And all through my life here in Nashville, my friends are really my family. And all the crises I've had, they've been right there with me. And I would walk to the school in the morning, and I would look at every blade of grass. I would just appreciate every blade of grass, and I loved the sunshine, and I loved the flowers that bloomed. It was just almost like a rebirth, because I was not able to enjoy that. I was, as a very small child in Germany, when I went to the kindergarten with the nuns, and and went to the fields to pick rather to the woods to pick blueberries. But that part of life, we were afraid to go outside. My mother was afraid to let me go be with other children because we were so afraid. She was so afraid that I would be harmed.
And the relationship with the May family, how did it continue? I mean, obviously they provided jobs, and so your mom and dad probably saw them on a daily basis.
On occasions, and if there was anything real important, we would go visit them, you know. But of course, they were in much different position than we were in, you know, financially, but we always kept that relationship, you know.
And which Mays were it that were living in Nashville, that were running the factory, and that had contact with your family at that time?
It was Jacob May was still alive, who was the brother of Abraham May that lived in my house. Also Mortimer May and his wife Gertie, and they had two children, Reba and Leon, who live here in Nashville now, and Dan May and his wife Dorothy. And they had two, Jack and Betsy May. And they were always very gracious to us and warm.
Did you ever, in times with them, or were any of their children, were any of the various generations your age?
Not really. And when you're younger, either they were a little bit too young for me or a little bit too old for me, you know.
What were your feelings about them on those occasions, special occasions when you'd go over there, or when your family sitting around the dinner table would talk about your dad's job and the maids? Did they hold a certain aura, perhaps because of what they enabled you to have?
Well, they were very special. Without them, I would not have these 50 extra years that I've had. I would have been annihilated like all my cousins and uncles and aunts. I feel that they gave us a gift of life, and nobody could be more endearing than that. I feel that I've experienced so many joys, and even the unpleasant things that I've experienced, at least I've been able to experience them. There are many people.
Did you ever once you were settled, did you guys ever make any effort to help get other family or friends out of Europe? Was there a way? Were there efforts made?
It was too late. It was too late. But we were possibly the last to leave because they were putting people in concentration camps. There was no way of leaving Germany. Then before we were a problem that could leave, the Jewish problem. But then the doors were closed. The problem was no longer allowed to leave. They were annihilated. So sometimes I wonder why I survived. You know, you get that feeling, why me? What am I supposed to be doing? Or what am I supposed to be doing something special?
There's a lot of confusion in the United States and in history as to when Americans really knew what was going on. You know, a lot of people hate Roosevelt because they think he must have known and he didn't.
Right.
You know, et cetera, et cetera. You got over here and the war was still going on. How did you know that it was too late? That the rest, did you know that the rest were gone, that they were in camps? You knew?
We knew. My grandparents lived there, and they moved to Switzerland. They knew. My relatives in France had to move to the south of France, but they survived. But we knew that the rest, we tried to get in touch with the uncles, but to no avail. So we knew they had either they were deceased, or we knew that they were unable to correspond with us. we were able to correspond with my grandparents.
Did you ever see your grandparents again?
No, never again.
And that town in Germany,
Breisach.
where you last saw them, they left there and went to Switzerland when the war got bad? And they lived out the rest of their years in Switzerland?
Yes, they went, I would say, right at 39 when we left. They went to Switzerland and spent the rest of their lives in Switzerland without either one of their children. My mother came to the U.S. They had a daughter, 2 daughters, and a son. The son was killed in a concentration camp. The other aunt moved to England. My Aunt Rosa moved to England.
What is your mother's full name? Clara?
Clara Geismar, Geismar.
And her married name was Reinheimer.
Right.
And do you remember your grandparents? Their name was obviously Geismar. Their names.
Correct. The other grandparents, my father's parents, had long been deceased.
But what were the Geismar's names? Do you remember?
Raphael and God, unbelievable. I can't think of my grandmother's
Hey, that's
first
not
name.
surprising. Listen,
I mean, that's unreal.
that was the grandfather, Raphael.
Yeah, Raphael.
Okay. And they lived
Bertha.
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 And which town in Switzerland was it where they lived out the rest of their years?
Endingen.
Spell it if you can.
E-N-D-I. I'm not sure. I'll have to sort of sit and write it in.
Okay. Did you ever go back? Are we close to the end of the tape by any chance? Okay. Yeah, because we're going to go into a whole different... Did you ever go back to your home, to Hooks?
50 years after I left Germany, I was invited back for commemoration of Kristallnacht. I reluctantly went. I wanted to go back and I didn't want to go back. It took me forever to make up my mind as to whether I wanted to return. Finally, I decided I would go back, and I returned to Germany in '89. And our flight to New York, we missed the plane going to Germany. And it was my decision that it was a bad omen, that I would not go to Germany. This was something telling me I shouldn't go back. I called both of my children. I called my son Ronnie, who lives in Nashville, and I called my son Bruce, who lives in Washington. And I said, I've decided to return home. I said, I just think I'm not supposed to go over there. I think it was sort of a frightened feeling on my part about going back. And they told me, they said, Mom, I think it's important that you go back, that you deal with what you felt in your heart all these years. I went back, and I'm from a small community. I'd say there were maybe 40 families, and Jewish families in my community at one time. Of course, there's not one family left. But when I returned, a gentleman met us in Frankfurt at the airport, and I went to Höchst, and I had such mixed emotions you wouldn't believe. It was terrible the way that I felt. I returned to my town, and they had provided for us, for about 14 people that returned, an inn, and they had koshered it. made it kosher, so people that did keep kosher would feel comfortable. The first day I was there, we met at the Rod House, which was the mayor's quarter, the courthouse. When I went to the courthouse, we sat around a huge table. The courthouse was a pretty large meeting room, and there were quite a few dignitaries, and the mayor was there, and he welcomed us former citizens of Höchst. And I was just so upset. I thought, you know, you didn't consider me a citizen of Höchst. And I looked outside, there were windows surrounding us, and I looked outside and I felt so much hatred in my heart. The scenery was very much like Nashville. The terrain, I should say, there are lots of hills in the community that I was born. And I could just see these hills, and I could see me running through the woods when I was a small child. And it took me quite a little while to feel comfortable. When they were through greeting us, there were many people that came over to me and hugged me and kissed me. And I thought to myself, why are they doing this? I don't know these people. Were these people that harmed my father, that harmed us when we were younger? And one lady came up to me and she said, my parents and I lived across the street from you. We were your Shabbos Goy. And I used to take care of you when you were a little girl. And she hugged me and kissed me and started crying. She invited me to her house. She says, please, Hedy, you've got to come visit us. I want you to come over to the house. I said, I don't know what's planned for us. You know, we'll just have to wait and see. And I really didn't feel like seeing any of those people, because I knew many of those people had taken possessions, had harmed us, and I was a small child. I didn't know whether this was a person that had done this to us. We did go to her house eventually, and we had coffee with her, my husband and I. And she told me, she said, Hedy, I could take you to a few houses. They have some of your things. I said, I'm not interested in things. I'm happy with all the things I have now. You know, that wasn't important to us. But it was interesting talking to some of the returnees. Some of them were from Argentina, from Buenos Aires, from Israel, from England.
People that grew up in the same town as you?
Same town as I, went to the same schools that I went to. We were all dispersed to different areas. And if we all didn't have the common language of German, which I thought a very poor German, because I was only 8.5 years old, and I spoke the German of probably an 8.5, 9-year-old child. I knew none of the big words. But I did express myself. They took us to a couple of synagogues that were now like museums. We were taken to all the surrounding towns to be welcomed by mayors. They named, while I was over there, a street after the rabbi that was our rabbi in Germany. They had a dedication. They had a town meeting while I was over there. And I would say I'd say 300 people showed up or more. And I got up and spoke a few words. There were several people that were there. There was the mayor. There were some clergymen. There was a gentleman from Israel that had come to Germany. He had been to Germany before, so he was at the head, on the podium like. So I got up and I told them what happened to me when I was a small child, how we ran through the woods, how we never had a comfortable day that I can remember. And I got up and I said, I speak a very poor German. I said, I speak the German of an 8.5 to 9-year-old child. I said, it's nobody's fault but yours. And they listened, and afterwards a man came over to me. He was an architect, and he ran over to me and he said, who did these things to you? Who harmed you and your family? And I said, I'm too young to really know. I said, I know there were people that did it. So I said, you'll have to ask Elsa Frank. She is a refugee from Germany. She came over probably in 32 or 33. She also lives in Nashville. And she had been back to Germany many times. I said, you'll have to ask Mrs. Frank. I said, she's old enough to know who the Nazis were, who they were. So she met with this gentleman, and some of the biggest Nazis were his parents. They were the beginning of the Nazi Party in our community. Well, I think he knew this all along. She had dinner with him, and the granddaughter. His mother was still alive, but he didn't invite her over. And she told him all the things that they did as Nazis. And he said, my daughter had a feeling that my parents were some of the biggest Nazis. And the grandchildren just won't have anything to do with the grandmother. While over there, we were also invited to speak to school children and the teachers. And I do think we made an impression on these children. Most of them were high school and probably 11th, 12th grade, 9th graders. And they asked Bible questions and were very interested. They had never seen a Jewish person before because there were no more in Höchst. There are some Jews still living in Germany now, though.
But there were none in your hometown
No,
when you went back?
Not a one.
I got to ask this, obviously you had mixed feelings during that visit. There were probably people that you really sensed were genuine.
It took me
a
long time to realize they were genuine.
Do you still think you're bitter? I mean, not just at them and at Germany, but did you see a side of human beings that maybe changed you?
I feel I'm really glad that I went. I mean, I know there's still lots of bad things going on there because they told me that, we as survivors have to speak out on this subject because they said now they're the Turks who are the minority there that could have problems. So I think it's very important that we speak out. And I felt a lot of these people that helped us while we were there were people in their 40s and say 45, 46. They were not born, some of them. And they genuinely want to know what happened. In fact, one man has written a book about my hometown. Has done a lot of research. And I have a book that he wrote. And he traced down, he and Mr. Huffelbat, Reiner Good wrote this book. And this is my synagogue on the book that was burned. While I was in Höchst, they put up a stone for our synagogue. They had a big ceremony at night, and they had a choir singing, and the mayor spoke, and that was, I shook so hard. I can't tell you, my husband was really concerned about me. It was such an emotional evening for me. There were people that came over and just hugged me, you know, for no reason at all. And we were surprised. The mayor didn't know how many people would show up, but there was a mass of people out there watching the ceremony. It was a really emotional evening. But I do feel, the ones that I met anyway, of course I only met a few people, I felt they were sincere in what they were doing. They needed to repent, I guess. One man that lived across the street from us, we went to his house and we had a cup of coffee, and we had to go to the cemetery. We were invited to go to the cemetery and look at the cemetery that was left. And when we went there, he took us. He's a man about 66, 67, so I'm sure he was in the war. And he kept hugging me and crying, and he kept saying, "Hedy, we had to do it. We couldn't help ourselves." He said, "You know, they would have taken us and sent us to a concentration camp." In fact, the day they took my dad to a concentration camp, a man across the street yelled, "Why are you, a non-Jewish person, why are you taking Mr. Reinheimer to a concentration camp?" They took him also. So this gentleman took us to the cemetery in Höchst, and when he left, he hugged and cried like a little baby. So they have a lot of feelings that they have to let loose. But I think some of them were genuinely sincere about their feelings. But there are still some there that are not too happy with the Jewish people, because they have to watch the cemetery that's left very closely, because on occasion it's destroyed again.
Mark, we're pretty much done except for this. Pick up the big one, for example. Tell us, what is this to you? What does it mean to you?
Well, this piece of crystal was one of the things that was thrown out of our home. Most of them were destroyed. This one survived, and I've had somebody file this down a little bit so I wouldn't cut myself on it. But I want this to be in my home at all times, and I want my children and my grandchildren, I want it passed on for generations. I don't want them ever to forget what happened to the Jewish people in Germany. And I think we have to be aware that it's happened too many times to us. And I have a little piece here that...
Hedy, talk to me, if you would, as opposed to the camera. What's that?
This is a little vase. And a Mr. Oppenheimer gave me this vase quite a few weeks before we left, because he wanted me to remember that family. Well, it was partially destroyed. You can see the little... But there's so few things that were left. Those that were not broken or destroyed, they were taken by the Nazis. I think I have like 3 pieces of crystal at home, stemware, that was left intact. But
and the other piece
is
also,
also, these are just reminders. This is just chipped on the ends, but just reminders that it did happen. And my children were schooled with this, not until they were old enough to know what happened. Because I just thought it was not important until they could understand what happened to us. So it's something I never want to forget. I can never forget it. It's like a bad dream. Sometimes I think, you know, how could anything so terrible happen to a people? My father never did anything wrong. And I mean, a child, I mean, what's bad about a young child? How can anybody hurt a young child? You just have to be a tyrant to do that. So these things are very precious to me.
And speaking of being a child, show us your passport and your picture and what, when you open that up, what's the first thing you see there?
The red means Juden, Jew. So each passport had Jew on it, you know, if you were Jewish.
If you were lucky enough to get one.
Absolutely. And this, my mother and father before, that are on the passport. I do remember going for the passport, and we had to go to Stuttgart, and we were quite frightened that we would not pass all their qualifications. And that's my brother and I.
Hold it if you would.
Mm-hmm. When we came over.
There's a stamp on the right that says January 5th, 1939.
That's when we got the passport.
And that was when you got the passport. It was after Kristallnacht, but before.
No, evidently this is when we left Germany.
I see.
I would think, yeah.
I see.
That's when we left. This has been back to Germany.
You took that?
Yeah. Well, this was sent back, and they have things in the book about our passport. I sent them many things.
Do you need her to hold that up and leaf through it again?
What, the
Just,
front?
Yeah, just, yeah.
This passport, I'd say, is over 50 years old.